Hi everyone, and welcome back to Carols of Wisdom from my first Know by Year. Last Christmas, we spent way too much. So, dressed in my concert black today because I am going to a performance right after this, the Ode to Saint Cecilia by Handel. So this might just be a quick check-in for today, maybe a finance check-in at that. So last Christmas we spent way too much, and this year we want to make that savings. Maybe not the greatest lyrics for the song, but working with what we have here. Maybe I'll come up with something better and insert text up here for you. So next year, one of my biggest priorities is going to be the budget and how to save with variable income and how to make saving the more default mechanism in my kind of financial life than spending or thinking about what I could buy with the extra income, or not even thinking about what I could buy, but even justifying being able to purchase something because of the extra money. And on this subject, I wanted to talk about the mismatch that I feel when I contemplate spending $10 versus saving $10. And the number is kind of arbitrary here. It's not because it's a low number. For me, actually, the threshold is actually kind of high, which is not a good thing. You know, like when I think about spending $100 versus saving $100, spending $100 doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Like, yes, when we get to three figures, $100 and more, it feels like more of a big deal. So maybe for the purposes of this example, I'll bring it back down. When I think about spending $20 versus putting that into a savings account, the impact of spending it doesn't feel that big, and the impact of saving it also does not feel that big. So this is almost like a bizarre take on girl math, where I'm not really motivated to save that smaller amount of money. It doesn't feel like it's going to make a difference in my everyday life, and not even in my savings goals, which I know is a futile mentality. The only way to make a difference in the savings goals is to put that money into savings, no matter how small. But it really does feel like a drop in the bucket. I was talking about this in the comments of, I think it was that video where I talked about the $500 jeans, where somebody was talking about how that money would translate to various living expenses. And this is where we're going to get a little bit personal yet again. And I'm going to share some possibly horrifying details where the $500 to me right now with our life expenses doesn't actually cover any of the essentials. So thinking of groceries, our house payment, whatever, you know, obviously $500 is a huge chunk of any of those categories. So I'm not arguing that. I'm not saying that I'm justifying spending that large of an amount of money. It's certainly not something I'm in a habit of doing, nor do I want to become in the habit of spending that much money on a routine basis. However, if $500 was, say, the grocery budget, I think it would be a much more easy parallel for me to see where, oh, that's a month of groceries that I'm spending on this one item. It's not. It's not the reality right now. And while, again, I appreciate how futile the mentality is of, oh, if $500 doesn't cover the groceries, so therefore I can just spend it. Like, that's not how I think. But the feeling I have as far as the value of just saving that money is difficult to surmount. It's difficult to really act in line with what I know would be better, if that makes sense. I need to make my true value paying myself first, even if that's just $20 here and there, even if it is $500 instead of putting that towards something that I want but don't need in the form of the pants. But again, like, part of it is just being in this kind of bottomless pit of floundering and living expenses where the cost of everything is so high right now. The grocery budget is so high. The house payment is so high with ridiculous interest. And again, to be complaining about the amount that our expenses are, but still being able to afford them is kind of ridiculous, and I can appreciate that as well. And I have not always lived this way as far as having high expenses. I had periods of life where I lived in a single room in a house for a few $100s a month. So I have lived both ends of the spectrum. And, you know, to be completely transparent here, my husband is the breadwinner of the family with a job with a much more average American salary than any income that I make. And I'll be sharing statistics about like average salaries. I have videos drafted already about money next year, finances, the concept of morality in money, what it's like to be wealthy versus not, things like that. So you can stay tuned for that if you're interested in that kind of subject for January. But you know, the popular recommendation, or maybe it's not so popular anymore, that your housing should be, what is it, 30% of your total take-home pay. Like, I think that's what Dave Ramsey uses. I mean, that is totally unrealistic for most people, I feel like. It's not just us, but for most people these days, like, that is really not realistic as far as the standard of living that most of us would prefer to have working certain jobs, right? And it goes without saying, perhaps, that we're not even close to that 30% mark for our income versus our house payment. So anyway, feel free to roast me in the comments for this kind of mentality issue that I'm having. And maybe the roasting is just what I need to get my mentality checked and to set the savings precedent. I shared earlier as well that any sales savings are going to be transferred to my savings account so that I will be spending the full amount on whatever I buy or bought already during the Black Friday sales. And I don't want that to be the end of this. I want it to go further so that in the future, when I contemplate a purchase of something that's not a need, I not only have to have the money for it, maybe I need to have double the money and put that extra into the savings so that I'm essentially buying it twice. I don't know, because step number one, priority number one, is to get the savings rate where it needs to be, right? So if I plan to save 20% of all of my income next year, I really need to hit that target. Or if I plan to fully fund my Roth IRA and put X amount into the emergency fund, those targets need to be met first. And so I'm not actually sure that I'll do the double the cost of the item thing, because it might defeat the purpose of having a budget for non-necessities. The budget amount for non-necessities does need to be set very mindfully in order to maybe suitably replace that mentality of having, double the money for the purchase of things you want. But anyway, I'm curious as to whether you've run into any of these mentalities yourself. Do you have kind of a savings amount where it's not really worth it to you to transfer $5 into savings? Or is that something that you do all the time? I've seen those apps too, like Acorns or whatever, that round up every purchase to the nearest dollar and deposit that change into savings. I've never tried anything like that. So if that's been satisfying for you, let me know. Maybe it'll help motivate me put those smaller amounts whenever I can into the savings account. But again, coming back to asking you the question, does it feel sometimes more satisfying to spend that $20 on something you want versus putting it into savings? Is it even more alluring if that $20 is something that's on sale that would normally cost more than $20? Does the thrill of the deal get to you? I'm happy to report that mentality is changing a little bit for me. And again, I referred to this in the video a couple days back about influencers and their discounts that they offer. If the product is being sold for a sale price, then what that communicates to me now is that it was never worth the full price to produce. And it might still have to be worth the full price for me to buy, but it does convey that from their end, the production end, the quality of the product end, the care that they put into creation, the product is not worth the retail price that they set. So it's almost like these two pieces come together to create a much more discerning buying and wanting experience for me as a consumer. And I hope that can be helpful for you too. The other category that really gets me is secondhand purchases, and feeling like, especially when oftentimes your money can go further when you're buying secondhand than new retail, and the cost will more accurately reflect the value of the item since it's not inflated, but the retail kind of, that's depreciated off of it already when it's on the resale market. So what the item is able to sell for is much more in line with what it's actually worth. So shopping secondhand is actually in some ways harder for me to break up with, because I don't feel like I'm supporting the practices of the brand or the influencers by getting it pre-loved. And the most recent kind of no-buy fails in the clothing department were all secondhand purchases. And then there's that trap of making money reselling and then using that money to fund those kind of future purchase, not mistakes, because I don't think these items are mistakes in my wardrobe, but things that I acquired that I debatably needed. Now, in this case, I am happy to report that, for example, the track pants have been worn very often on a weekly basis. And to me, that signifies that they were a good purchase for me. They were a good fit for my life and my wardrobe. The fact that I was using them immediately and often is a positive signifier and shows that I really evaluated correctly my needs of the time. And I hope that that's the case for anything I bring into my life, not just my wardrobe, but my life as a whole going forward. And I hope that can be the case for you too. I feel like this kind of emotional math, last Christmas we spent way too much. The emotional math of the season is something we are more susceptible to at holiday times, times of giving. And the feeling of, oh, this $20 will have more of an impact if I spend it here than if I save it, is kind of one that's more easy to fall into this year, a mentality that's easier to adopt. Almost because in some ways it feels more selfish to save at this time of year than it is to spend on giving, which is maybe a little bizarre as well. And I guess there is an important qualifier here that giving is not always through buying stuff. You can give in terms of donating money as well. And there is an element that I feel at this time of year, the spirit of giving, that giving money is more noble than saving the equivalent money. And, you know, there's all sorts of baggage, loaded narratives of these kind of perceptions. And I am going to address the kind of narratives of donating and giving of money later this year or early next year as I explore my first donation of 10% of the income that this channel has generated. Anyway, with those thoughts, I will wrap up there for today, and I will see you tomorrow.